When we talk about World War II, the conversation almost immediately collapses into a single name and a single face. History remembers Adolf Hitler as the supreme architect of the century's horrors, a solitary tyrant who dragged the globe into a nightmare of his own making. Go to almost any history classroom or open any mainstream textbook, and you will find the exact same framework. He operates in a complete vacuum, an isolated anomaly of evil that somehow managed to hijack the entire planet. But looking closely at the historical data creates a strange paradox. If the title of ultimate villain is awarded based strictly on the sheer volume of mass murder, the math suddenly doesn't add up. By crowning him as a solitary monster, we draw a highly convenient circle around the tragedy. We stop looking at the vast global machinery and the deeply entrenched systemic forces that actually enabled him. Look at Mao Zedong in China. During his Great Leap Forward, an aggressive push to rapidly industrialize an agrarian society, he engineered a massive man-made famine. That specific policy resulted in the deaths of 30 to 40 million people in just a few years. Over in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin was running the Great Purge and the Holodomor. Through forced starvation in Ukraine and brutally freezing labor camps known as Gulags, his policies killed over 20 million citizens. Meanwhile, scientists in Japan's secretive Unit 731 were conducting horrific biological experiments on living human beings. Yet when the war ended, many of those key researchers were quietly hired by the United States government for their technical expertise. Hitler was undeniably a tyrant, but when we look at these numbers, a clear question emerges. Why does our collective memory treat him as a unique, isolated phenomenon, while these other names are often relegated to the footnotes of history? The foundation for that era was poured in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. This was nominally designed as a peace treaty, but in execution, it was a financial death sentence for Germany, demanding impossible economic reparations that gutted the nation's industry. The economic fallout was devastating. Germany experienced hyperinflation so extreme that the national currency became entirely worthless. Citizens were burning stacks of cash in their stoves just to stay warm because the paper was cheaper than firewood. Inside this desperation, political elites saw an opportunity. Established leaders like Franz von Papen and President Paul von Hindenburg looked at a rising, charismatic extremist and made a fatal calculation. They appointed him chancellor, fully expecting they could use him as a highly effective, controllable tool. Within weeks, that supposed puppet outplayed them. Following a massive arson attack on the Reichstag Parliament building, he immediately invoked emergency powers to dissolve the democratic process and seize absolute control. Totalitarian power isn't always seized by a violent coup. Often, it is formally granted by established politicians who believe they can leverage an extremist for their own gain. This map shows a timeline of Jewish expulsions across Rome, England, France, and Spain. It reveals a highly uncomfortable truth. Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism. He simply weaponized a prejudice that the global community had spent hundreds of years building and normalizing. By the 1920s, this hostility was an openly accepted political stance worldwide. In the United States, industrial icon Henry Ford was using his massive fortune to publish and distribute extensive anti-Semitic propaganda to hundreds of thousands of readers. That ideological overlap quickly translated into highly profitable corporate complicity. Global giants like Ford, BMW, and IBM supplied the Nazi regime with massive amounts of resources, vehicles, and the specific punch card technology required to efficiently track and target minority populations. The political support was just as explicit. At the Munich Agreement, the Allied nations effectively signed off on Germany's aggressive military expansion. They offered up foreign territories as a diplomatic sacrifice, choosing to look the other way to protect their own borders. The Soviet Union went a step further. They signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact directly with Germany, carving up a map of Poland so both nations could swallow half the country without interfering with each other's military campaigns. The path to World War II was paved by specific choices made in boardrooms and embassies across the globe. It required a network of international cooperation, corporate investment, and diplomatic silence to turn a single man's ideology into a global catastrophe. By 1945, the dust settled over a completely shattered world. The war was over, the original instigators were dead, and the victorious Allied powers sat down to write the definitive history of the 20th century. But those victors had a massive public relations problem. They had their own horrific atrocities to answer for, ranging from engineered colonial famines to long histories of diplomatic appeasement and corporate collaboration with the enemy. To sanitize their own ledgers and protect those massive corporate institutions from prosecution, the global system engaged in a massive act of historical erasure. They concentrated all the world's sins, all the blame, and all the evil into one singular, undisputed face. Acknowledging this mechanism does not excuse a single atrocity committed by the Nazi regime. Hitler remains a tyrant who orchestrated the slaughter of millions in cold blood. But when we lazily accept the narrative that he was a spontaneous, isolated anomaly of evil, we blind ourselves to the actual mechanics of tyranny. Monsters are manufactured by broken systems, by deeply greedy corporations and complacent politicians. And if we ignore the blueprint, we leave ourselves entirely vulnerable to the next one.